Hello.
You take it. Thank you, Amir.
Hello, Amir. Thank you for your patience and sorry to be late with the program. Just allow me 1 minute to introduce your presentation. So, Amir is a senior manager at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so an expert from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So we have the chance that he accepted to speak to us today to make the link between CCU and the GHG Protocol. I have sent you a science briefing on this subject a few weeks ago. Many of you sent, or some of you sent me some questions that I have transmitted to Amir. So in his presentation, he will answer some of your questions. There are very surely questions remaining, so please take the chance to prepare your questions and ask him questions at the end of his presentation, because I think it's a unique opportunity to get to know more about this complicated subject. So there will be more or less 20-25 minutes of presentation, and then we will have enough time for questions. So be ready with your questions. Thank you very much, Amir. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Celia. Good afternoon and good evening to you, as well as to all the participants in the room. And thank you so much for your invitation. It is a pleasure to be here to represent the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. My presentation consists of two parts. First, I will go through the update process of the corporate suite of standards we're going through. And then I will introduce the land sector and removal guidance and standard, which introduces the requirements and the accounting rules for how to account for all types of carbon removals, as well as storage activities within the corporate GHG inventories. Next slide. And the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, well, I think many of you already know about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards. This is just an intro to our organization. The GHG Protocol has been convened by the World Resources Institute, or WRI, as well as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. And as you know, it provides a standards framework for the corporates, for the cities and the countries to measure, manage, and report under GHG emissions. Organically, and also through a number of professional activities, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has become the world's most widely used GHG accounting standard. By statistics, more than 90% of the corporates, for example, report to CDP use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards. And all the GHG Protocol standards are developed through an inclusive global multi-stakeholder development process that includes representations from businesses, from academia, from government, NGOs, as well as the civil society. Next slide. And here it shows a history of the publication of the GHG Protocol standards. You see the ones on the top that are most relevant and used by the corporate sector, starting with the publication of the corporate standard in 2004, the Scope 3, as well as the product lifecycle standard in 2011. The Scope 2 guidance was published in 2015, and since 2020, we have started working on the land sector and removal guidance, which will be finalized by the end of this year. Publication is expected beginning of next year. I will delve through the contents of the land sector and removal guidance in a bit. Next slide. And this graph is a sort of a flagship image from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It shows how the Greenhouse Gas Protocol categorizes the corporate GHG inventory into three different scopes. And I'm not going through the details of these scopes because I think the audience in the room might be familiar. Scope 1 report, of course, relates to the direct emissions, and Scope 2 and 3 are the value chain emissions, Scope 2 being specific to the energy sector. Next slide. And just a hint that many of course, our users know the Greenhouse Gas Protocol by the Scope 1, 2, and 3. But we also, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards, they also introduced the Greenhouse Gas Protocol emission report that includes all the additional information the companies may like to include, for example, regarding the purchase of credits, other instruments, etc., as well as, for example, GHG impacts of ash cancer financing. And beyond that, we're looking at the full ecosystem of climate disclosure, sustainability reports, goal and target setting, etc., which are, of course, within this ecosystem of the GHG accounting, but might not be directly related to the GHG inventory. So I will use this, I would say, consistent terminology throughout my presentation today. Next slide. So this is just an introduction to why the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has started working on the update of its corporate standard. In a nutshell, since the publication of our standards, of the corporate standard, there has been so many developments in the field, namely the trends towards the net zero target. Actually, in fact, the development of SBTI as an organization over years, the mandatory climate disclosure regulations, for example, in US and in EU. In the previous conversation, there were a number of mentions about that, as well as, of course, the use of the greenhouse gas protocol standards widely by the corporate sector as well as academia. So there has been more insights and research on the topic and new insights, in fact. Um, Between 2022 and 2023, the GHG Protocol launched a survey for the public to provide the feedback on the current suite of corporate standards, and we have gathered and collected this feedback, and we have shared this with public through our channels that I will also present in this presentation. That constitutes the basis for the update of the standards we are looking into. And one of the main goals of the standards is indeed about alignment with other parts of the ecosystem, other standards setters, as well as the regulatory programs that are, of course, instrumental towards implementation of the GHG Protocol standards. Next slide. This is a process we go through for any standard development process, starting with the global survey feedback and proposal submission by the public. We have now finalized developing our working plans and forming our governance bodies. During the New York Climate Week just last week, we officially launched our technical working group members, our independent standard board, as well as our steering committee members. We have just started working on the multi-stakeholder development of our standards, which will take us at least 2 years, and we expect to finalize and publish the updated corporate suite of standards in 2026 or afterwards. Next slide. And this shows the four different work streams you're working on, the three different suites of standards, the corporate standard, scope 2 and scope 3, but then also another work stream, what we call the market-based accounting approaches, which touches up on so many of the conversations we had in the previous presentation about the use of certificates within the corporate GHG inventory. Next slide. So I will spend a few minutes on these to also provide some context in terms of where the greenhouse gas protocol is in terms of the application of certificate to the GHG inventory. Within the survey that we have launched to the public, and again, the previous slide showed all the information that are publicly available on our website in terms of proposal submission, survey feedback, etc. We refer to market-based accounting mechanisms as in two different ways, mechanisms designed to enable contractual traceability in a supply chain with limited physical traceability. This is, for example, the case of book and claim systems or probably mass balance, and mechanisms designed to measure and establish the relationship of the emission reduction or removal associated with the project or intervention. An example of that are the credits, offset or inset credits. Next slide, please. The survey we launched to the public included specifically these five different instruments with the definition that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has provided, and also asked the public what should be the role of these instruments within the corporate GHG inventory. Next slide. And the high-level feedback we received from the public, as we are working on those again as part of our standard development process, is that firstly, there is significant interest across survey for enabling methods to account for the impact of mitigation actions. And the recognition that the existing disclosure and target setting programs mainly focus on inventory counting, that is what takes place within the scopes, and methods to account for mitigation impacts needs to be clarified and recognized within target setting and goal setting programs. The respondents also asked GHG Protocol to provide clarity on the counting methods applicable to both of the impacts within and out of the scopes. So some of these mechanisms, of course, the impacts go beyond the scopes, as well as and around the reporting and use of claims associated with project impacts, market-based instruments, etc. There was a strong emphasis on harmonization between the requirements of different voluntary as well as regulatory programs. GHG Protocol is indeed a voluntary standard. Next slide. And there were, in general, three range of responses were received from the public in terms of how these instruments should be accounted within the GG inventory or out of it by the corporate sector. As you see, there were three range of responses with their specific justification. Respondents asked for inclusion of such instruments within the scope. Some asked for some require some ask for the reporting to be done separately. It's for transparency mainly, or to potentially to contribute to targets. And some respondents considered no role for the use of such instruments within the GH inventory. Again, this is just to give you a flavor of the topics we are now discussing and working on as part of our working group on the market-based accounting, or mitigation impact approach, as we have recently renamed the work stream. And with that, the rest of my presentation is about the land sector and removal guidance, which is a recent standard we have been working on and is expected to be published end of this year, beginning of next year. Thank you so much. Um, so the first slide shows a bit of background about the guidance. What is the purpose of the guidance? The existing corporate suite of standards, the ones that I was just showing some of the in the previous slides, have been mainly focused on how to account for emissions across different scopes. They mainly ignore carbon removals, and also they do not include detailed methodology on how to account for emissions and removals for the land-based activities. And there's indeed an interlink between removals and land sector when we talk about it, because the natural carbon removal, in fact, take place on the land. And that is why this standard provides guidance and requirements for the corporate sector to account for emissions and removals from the land sector, as well as any types of other types of removal and storage activities, which also come to technological removal as well as CCU applications. The standard is built on top of the existing corporate and Scope 3 standard. In fact, all the reporting frameworks are done within the same reporting framework. The companies need to adopt the standard, and then additional reporting categories have been introduced that needs to be filled in by the corporate sector according to the guidance we have provided within this standard. The intended audience is indeed clear. As I just mentioned, the land sector companies, as well as companies who are active in the value chain of technological CO2 removal and storage. And also, there are new insights regarding how to account for and report GHG credits within the GHG inventory for a corporate sector, especially inset credits. So the companies that also buy and sell credits should also refer to this new standard for the latest guidance. Next slide, please. Um, Similar to the other standards, we have gone through a multi-stakeholder development process to develop the land sector and removal guidance. This activity has been going on since 2020. The Secretariat is indeed WRI and WBCST, who co-convened the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We had 20 advisory committee members who their role was and is to provide strategic guidance on the goals and direction of the project. And we had our technical working group members who were our technical experts, more than 100 technical experts who developed the technical content of the guidance and the standard with the support of the Secretariat. We have engaged with more than 300 external reviewers as part of our pilot testing, as well as around 100 pilot testing companies who pilot tested the guidance and standard that gave us very valuable feedback for the final publication of the guidance. Next slide. This slide shows the structure of the land sector and removal standard. It follows a logical structure and steps that the company should follow to obtain assurance and ultimately report the GHG inventory of its emissions. Starting with defining the business goals and inventory design, compiling the GHG inventory, act based on GHG inventory, and finally obtain assurance and report the inventory. As you see on the right side, there are different chapters of the standard, and some of them are mainly relevant to the companies, for land sector companies. Some of them are relevant to any company who use any type of carbon removal activity within their value chain. And some of these chapters are relevant for the companies based on their specific business goal. For example, a company specifically investing on in a specific type of storage or product storage, where they can specifically refer to Chapter 15 as well as any previous relevant chapters. Next slide. And I will spend the next few minutes to go through three topics from the guidance. First, how is removal being defined within the land sector and removal standard? Then, how to account for geologic storage in reservoirs? And finally, I will talk about how the greenhouse gas protocol land sector and removal guidance recognizes product storage and the requirements around reporting on that. Starting with removal, all these definitions are taken from the latest draft standard that is now being under development. A removal is a transfer of the greenhouse gas from the atmosphere to storage within a not atmospheric pool. That's the definition we have adopted since around 4 years ago. Just wanted to note that in this case, as you see, removal doesn't include only the capture, but also includes the storage. So there's a durability and duration of storage that is linked to the definition of carbon removal. A sink is the process, activity, or mechanism that removes the GHG from the atmosphere. And as you know, there are two types of sinks, being biogenic. The process is mainly photosynthesis that removes CO2 from the atmosphere. And then we have technological sinks, mechanical or chemical processes that remove the CO2 from the atmosphere or capture biogenic CO2 from the source and store it in a type of storage. And as you see, there are examples of these type of sinks, or as we call carbon removals in this case, because carbon removals can be associated to the type of sink where they're being sourced from. Next slide. Reporting removals, according to the land sector and removal guidance, is optional, but if the companies account for and report removals as part of their GHG inventory, they must meet a number of requirements that we have detailed out into the guidance. They're brought on here. I'm going through them very quickly, but if you have any questions afterwards, happy to go through the detail of any of these bullet points. The companies shall report on all emissions and account for removals based on annual or annualized carbon stock increases, should have traceability throughout the full CO2 removal pathway, specifically to detect any reversal or carbon losses from specific carbon pools. They should have sufficient data quality regarding the sink and the pools and the processes. They should ensure consistent Scope 3 allocation of removals to prevent double counting. This is imperative within a value chain where several companies are engaged in an activity that includes removal. And finally, they shall meet the permanence principle by ensuring that CO2 removals reporting and inventory are monitored and any losses of stored carbon are accounted for and reported. And this last piece is the next slide that I'm showing to you in terms of there are four different mechanisms, or if I can call requirements, that we have put here that the land sector removal guidance include. The company shall have a monitoring plan. They shall have a traceability system. They should include uncertainty in their calculations, and they shall have a mechanism to report, to detect and report the losses of stored carbon as part of their removal activities. These requirements have been introduced to meet the permanence and the conservative principles that have been adopted as part of development of this process. The definition of these principles are brought up in the right side of this slide. For the sake of time, I will skip over and I go through the geologic removals. Well, this might be a case of interest for many audience in the room. How the removals how the removals are accounted for within the GHG inventory. The land sector removal guidance requires the companies to report Scope 1 the removals in their Scope 1 if both the company um, if the company both owns the sink that removes the CO2 from the atmosphere as well as the pool where the carbon is stored. So in this case, a removal is counted as Scope 1. In any other case where the pool, where the entity that owns or controls the sink is different from the entity that owns or controls the pool, this is counted as Scope 3 removal. And in the case that, of course, it doesn't meet the removals requirement, which I just showed you in the previous slide, this is not counted as removal. Next slide. Accounting for geologic carbon pools is a specific chapter within the guidance as well. In a nutshell, this depends how to account for capture of CO2 and storage in the geologic carbon pool depends on the source of carbon and the type and its origin. In the sense that if it is a captured GHG pathway, if the CO2 has been captured from the stack before it's released to the atmosphere, this would show up differently in a scope or the GHG inventory of the company versus if this is a removal, in the case that has been removed from the atmosphere and then being stored. The guidance provides detailed recommendation, requirements, and guidance on how to account for the GHG emissions from the removal activities in both of these scenarios, with detailed case studies and examples that will be published as second part of the standard and guidance. Next slide. And this slide shows the technological removal accounting categories. Once again, for the sake of time, I will skip this slide. But as you see, there are several types of reporting categories. Some are being required, and some are being optional, depending on, um, yeah, basically, depending on where the companies also sit within the value chain specifically. Next slide. And finally, a topic that has been it's in questions by some of the audience: how to account for product carbon storage. We have also had more than 4 years of discussion on accounting for carbon storage within the products, and there has also been some cases that this was introduced as a sort of removal, but the final publication referred to it as what we call a product carbon storage, as I've shown it in this slide. This depends according to our definition, the product carbon storage is the carbon stored in product carbon pools that is derived from biogenic or technological CO2 sink. And the product carbon pool refers to the carbon contained in products or materials during the use phase of the products, including recycling and use. In fact, if the product goes to its end of life and towards waste, for example, landfill, any carbon stored is not a part of the product carbon storage. It's being separately reported into the waste, which we have guidance for that as well. This slide shows the requirements that the companies shall meet to account for the product carbon storage as part of their GHG inventory. The accounting should be based on stock change accounting approach. They should have high specific data quality. They shall only report the carbon storage if the product carbon stock has been increasing, and they should also report any losses of stored carbon that happens during the life cycle of the product. Next slide. And these are additional requirements, now specifically reporting requirements for the product carbon storage. The land sector and removal guidance requires the company to separately report the product carbon storage in case they would like to. This is optional again, as I mentioned. And this is reported under Scope 3, Category 11, under a separate reporting category called product carbon storage that we'll introduce as part of the broader GHG inventory templates. And finally, separate reporting of biogenic and TCDR-based product carbon storage. So the template that we have designed divides these two based on the origin of the carbon and specific type of sink and pool we are referring to. And there are some provisions regarding how to account for carbon storage within the waste carbon pools. Very similar to the product carbon storage, they should be separately reported in Scope 3, Category 12, and emissions and removals are not fungible with any type of storage. This should be separately reported for the sake of transparency according to the GHG Protocol. I pause here. I think this is my last slide. I would be open to any Q&A, and thank you once again.
Thank you, Amir, for your presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Maybe just to start, so that you have a few minutes to think about it. We spoke a lot about the concept of substitution of fossil carbon and the concept of emission avoidance, especially when we speak about carbon utilization. Could you please define these two concepts?
More than happy to do so. Absolutely, Celia. So what we call concept of substitution, the background, the greenhouse gas protocol standards are based on what we call inventory accounting, or in the life cycle assessment world, attributional life cycle assessments. In fact, it looks at the emissions and removals that has taken place historically, for example, over the last year, and the companies account for it within their GHG inventory. Substitution, what you mentioned, is in fact, or avoidance is very much sometimes the same. It looks at the delta between the emission at this point and the emission reduction of a specific project or product in a potential future scenario, and looks at the delta between that emission reduction and that future scenario and accounts for that. So avoidance, and this is what we call substitution, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has what we call the project protocol standard that specifically provides requirements on how to account for emission reduction, specifically as part of substitution activities, for example. So this is one aspect. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is you mentioned about the issue of avoidance. Avoided emissions is a very big topic that we have been, of course, hearing as is a major issue that we will discuss as part of our future standard update. There has been requests and interest by the users of our standard to recognize in one way or the other the case of avoided emissions within the GHG inventory. And as I just now mentioned, there is a methodological issue on how to incorporate avoided emissions into the GHG inventory, because avoided emissions follow different accounting methodology, being intervention accounting methods. This is something we are looking at very closely as part of our standard update process. But at this point of time, any type of avoided emission as a matter of any activity should be separately reported, separate from the scopes in a separate reporting category, for example, called avoided emission by the corporate sector. That's one thing. I also heard so many interesting discussions and conversations about the role of regulations, and I wanted to clarify that point. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a global standard applicable to all the sectors and all the countries, regardless of the type of regulations they have. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as part of the development, we try to be neutral enough to allow for additional legislations or regulations to be built on top of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There are many good voluntary programs that are good examples of that. The US SEC, for example, has adopted the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard as well. So I'm saying that because there are so many certifications, for example, that report avoided emission of a specific type of, for example, biogas, and that has been adopted in several regions globally. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is not even in the place to comment on that. We provide accounting rules. A company working in a specific region, of course, they can follow the legislations, and then they can report the GHG inventory according to GHG Protocol, and then follow that regulations. There's no conflict between these two.
Thank you very much for your answer. I'll take any questions from the audience now. Yes, Pablo.
Yes, Pablo from Tecnalia. One question you mentioned in the removal part, that one of the requirements was the permanent storage, or the permanence principle, but then it was long term. Could you specify what is that long term, time of years?
Absolutely. In fact, we do not refer to a specific duration when we define ongoing storage monitoring. We say the definition actually refers to mechanisms should be in place to report and to monitor the specific carbon pools and report to detect and report any losses from that carbon pool. So we are actually requiring the companies to provide an ongoing storage monitoring to ensure that the removal that they report in the GHG inventory has been maintained and in fact has been stored. And if there is that removal is actually there's a reversal of that carbon removal, then they can detect it and report it up as part of their inventory. There's no specific duration for that. As long as the company wants to report on the carbon removal, this ongoing storage monitoring should be put into place to ensure the permanence of the stored carbon.
Thank you, Amir. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. You're specifically referring and focusing on corporate accounting. What we have heard before from myself was on product carbon footprints and product certification. So can you say a few words about how Greenhouse Gas Protocol supports or not product carbon footprints and product related inventories? And perhaps a second question that's a bit at the side, but I'm curious. You said the Greenhouse Gas Protocol can be used for countries. Countries do the reporting and inventories for the Paris Agreement. Is that in any way related to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol inventories for countries or not? Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the questions, in fact. In terms of your first question, the product-related emissions, in fact, as you better know, there's an inherent connection between product carbon footprinting and corporate GHG accounting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has also published the Product Lifecycle Accounting Standard in 2011, along with the Scope 3 standard, which provides the accounting rules for the products, in fact. And is very much hand in hand with the Scope 3 standard in the sense that looking at the company, for example, in the middle of the value chain, the product that comes to the inventory of that company or being used by that company, of course, the product carbon footprint can be used to account for the emissions of that, which gets into the GHG inventory of the corporate sector. So there is inherent connection between these two. We understand those, and all of our standards, they also have a flavor of some specific product-specific requirements. For example, the land sector includes several clauses and requirements on allocation that is very product-specific and is not corporate-specific. So that's to answer your first question. And this also relates to the specific instruments we were talking about. So we understand some of the instruments are sector-specific or product-specific. So our new standards should also have a flavor on those, indeed, in one way or the other. In terms of your second question, yes, this is the less known part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We also have Greenhouse Gas Protocol for cities or for regions, for example, that have also been adopted globally. And some cities and regions they use to report under GHG emissions. On the country level, you're correct, of course. That's another world, and we're talking about the IPCCs of this world. But on the national or cities level, the GHG Protocol also has standards, which you can find them on our websites.
Thank you, Amir. One more question?
Thank you very much. Very nice presentation. I learned a lot about that. And my question is that what rules do you think would motivate substitution of CCU fuels from fossil fuels and provide incentives for the user who has selected CCU fuels? I mean, carbon recycled fuels. And we expect that the discussions on CCU is included in the current revision process. Is it correct? Is my understanding correct? If yes, then calculated and reporting rules for CCU fuels also being discussed as part of it. This is my question. Thank you.
Absolutely. So maybe I first answer your second question. Indeed, the aim of the land sector and removal guidance has been providing the requirements and the guidance for the corporate sector to account for all types of carbon removal and storage activities, including CCU. So these are our requirements that will be, as I mentioned, public early next year, hopefully, as when we publish the standard. Now, in terms of there, indeed, as soon as the conversation about the instrument that you were presenting in your presentation, for example, or the instrument that I just mentioned in some of my slides, for example, the credits, mass balance, or book and claim system, as long as those come in, they will all be treated as part of a standard update process, because in transparency, we need to have a global perspective, and going through multi-stakeholder development process, these are very important decisions regarding the GHG inventory. But to answer your specific question, I specifically do not know how to answer that. The aim of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards is to provide a consistent standardized framework for all the corporate sector to report under GHG emissions. And in the case that the CCU fuel, for example, has lower global GHG emissions, with the GHG inventory of the corporate sector should be able to show that, and that is already a mechanism or an incentive for the corporates who use that fuel to be able to actually report lower GHG emissions. So this is how I do see it. It also very much links to the other topic that I mentioned, is that there might be some cases that regulations should come in and provide specific pushes for specific incentives. And that is something that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is flexible enough to, of course, to be able to, account for those according to those legislation rules and not bend the Greenhouse Gas Protocol rules. So I hope this gave you was this helpful?
Thank you, Amir. One more question from the audience.
From Veolia. Are you considering implementing or revisiting the rules for the corporates? For example, in the waste sector, we are operating the assets on the behalf of municipalities. We are not owner of the asset, but we operate, and we might be holder of the permit. How do you consider this kind of situation where we are taking the burden of CO2 and we have no action on acting to reduce CO2 emissions? In fact, it's a question about operational control in this case.
Correct. These type of questions were similar to some of the ones that we have received as part of the Scope 3 standard update process. It came up across several sectors. You mentioned this, but indeed is also very relevant for the financial sector when, for example, some companies, they operate on behalf of other companies. I'm not sure if I 100% understood your example, but I would say that any developments, if there are in the field, will be a part of our update process, specific the Scope 3 standard. What you just mentioned is very much the topic of Scope 3 and specific categories regarding waste, for example.
Thank you, Amir. If there are no other questions, I just want to ask you one last question, or maybe two last questions, except because we have a few more minutes. We spoke about the book and claim system, and because we have questions from our e-fuel producers saying that their clients want to get the attributes of the Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions, and we want to understand why is that. Can you comment on that?
Well, again, I'm putting my greenhouse gas protocol aside, and I try to give an answer based on my personal knowledge. I think this is one of the issues we are grappling with as part of the update process as well. One of the reasons we are looking holistically at all these type of instruments is that as part of the greenhouse gas protocol and a standard setter, we should ensure that all the emissions have been reported globally and no emissions has been double counted or not counted if it should be counted. In the case that a company is, for example, purchasing a product from a book and claim system, and they're asking for their supplier to provide more evidence on their Scope 1 and 3, it might be the case that they want to verify if the company, for example, has been consistently applying, for example, allocation across their products, or they want to ensure that all the emissions at the factory level have been accounted for, or maybe have been translated into product carbon footprints. So I think this is a part of somehow this is something that we will see probably increasing over the next few years. And indeed, the role that, for example, the GHG Protocol should play in the middle, what information should be exchanged among some of the partners in a specific system, is one of the things we're looking into.
Thank you. And a very last and general question. Now, so we see that in the current versions of the standards and guidances, I don't speak about the land and sector standard and guidance, but what is now in place, there are no clear incentives to do carbon capture and utilization or to do circular carbon economy. Do you think this could change, and how do you see it could change?
Well, I think so. I think the first step towards, in fact, incentivizing a specific sector in terms of now we're talking about carbon storage and reutilization and recycling, is indeed having the standards and framework in place. When we launched the land sector and removal guidance, we launched a survey and we asked how many companies account for the removal activities and basically carbon storage. And the second question was why. If you don't, why you don't? The major answer that we received, the highest percentage of the responses, was the lack of enough specific corporate guidance. And that's why we started embarking on this. So indeed, I think this will definitely fill some of the existing gaps. The land sector and removal guidance come into publication, which then gives clarity on that. Beyond that, we indeed need additional tools, guidances, data sources, e-learning, training, and many other factors here to be able to boost that sector. Which, of course, I think this is something that could be an interesting conversation for this audience to see how could be incentivized on that front as well.
Thank you very much for your answers and for your presentations. So I think, I hope we can keep the contact, and we will think together also as an organization on how we can contribute also to make the subject of CCU evolve also in terms of accounting. So thank you very much, Amir, and all the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you and to the entire audience. And have a great visit.